Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something pretty monumental.
Hmm.
We're navigating, well, basically 2,500 years of philosophical wrestling over free will versus determinism.
Yeah, it's a beast of a topic. We've gathered a serious stack of sources here, and we're zooming in on 5 key thinkers: Plato, Leibniz, Hobbes, Hume, and Hegel. How do they handle this?
Exactly. And our mission today isn't just, an academic exercise. We want to get a really solid, fast understanding of their specific arguments.
And crucially, what the stakes are. Because these ideas, they have massive implications for how we think about moral responsibility, about justice, even just what it means to be a rational person making choices.
Okay, let's jump right in then. The core problem, the big tension here is this. On one hand, our whole ethical life, everything about praise, blame, reward, punishment, it seems to demand free will.
We feel free, right? I mean, subjectively, it feels like we make choices.
Totally. But then you look at a lot of rigorous philosophy, and increasingly science too, and it often points towards determinism, the idea that our actions might just be the inevitable result of prior causes.
So if everything is potentially predictable, tracing back through a chain of causes, where does real, genuine freedom actually fit in? Or does it?
That's the knot. That's what these 5 philosophers were trying to untangle. So we absolutely need some clear definitions up front.
Good idea. When our sources talk about free will, what they generally mean is this inherent ability that rational people, agents, have to choose a course of action from among real, open alternatives.
Not just feeling like you chose, but actually could have chosen differently.
Exactly. And critically, most philosophers link this directly to moral responsibility. If you chose action A and you genuinely could have chosen B instead, then you're responsible for the consequences of A.
Okay, that makes sense. And the opposing view, the force pushing against that.
That's causal determinism. This is the view that free will is, well, limited, maybe even an illusion, or just doesn't exist at all.
Why not?
Because, the argument goes, every event, including every human action, is the necessary result of prior causes and conditions, plus the laws of nature.
So everything that happens had to happen.
In a deterministic universe, yes. The roots of this are deep, often tied to the idea that everything has an explanation, or like Leibniz put it, everything that is has a sufficient reason for being the way it is and not some other way.
Ah, you brought him up already. Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, that sounds like a cornerstone for determinism.
It really is. Leibniz was one of the first to really crystallize this. If every single event, including every choice you make, has a necessary and sufficient reason why it occurred.
Then where's the freedom, if the reasons dictate the outcome?
Precisely. The choice becomes just the inevitable output of those reasons and causes. It's not truly unconditionally free in that scenario.
Okay, so that sets up the core conflict, but let's bring it home for the listener. Why should we, today, really care about these debates, some from centuries ago?
Because the implications are incredibly practical. They're, frankly, existential for how our societies function.
How so?
Well, think about our justice systems. Every developed society has one, right? And the entire structure, police, courts, prisons, it's all built on the fundamental idea that individuals are responsible for what they do.
You commit a crime, you are held accountable.
Right. But if philosophical determinism is actually true, if our actions are just the unavoidable results of past events and brain chemistry and upbringing,
Then the whole idea of accountability starts to look shaky.
exactly. Punishment, reward, even rehabilitation, it all kind of collapses. It becomes less about justice and more about just managing behavior, like social engineering. Can you truly blame someone if they literally could not have done otherwise?
So moral responsibility is the absolute linchpin here. If true freedom disappears, the moral logic we use every day, you deserve this reward, you deserve this punishment, it just falls apart.
It really does. And philosophers like David Hume, even while he was leaning towards determinism in many ways, he understood how much society relies on assigning moral consequences.
And what was his take on that?
Hume basically argued that, yes, individuals are held morally responsible and they get rewarded or punished. But for him, it was also about social mechanics. Punishment acts as a deterrent. It makes predictable, socially acceptable behavior more appealing.
So it shows future behavior, makes society more orderly. It's about the utility of holding people responsible based on the predictability of cause and effect.
You've got it. His theory leaned heavily on that predictability. Cause, consequence, behavior, response.
Okay, and we see something a bit similar, but maybe with higher, more cosmic stakes in Plato.
Definitely. For Plato, moral choices weren't just about social order. They were crucial for the soul's journey in the afterlife. Achieving a heavenly state or progressing spiritually depended on the moral quality of your choices.
And these choices had to be.
They had to be freely chosen, in his view, to provide the sort of divine cause needed for the soul's advancement. It gives the choice this eternal significance, way beyond just what's useful for society right now.
But whether we're talking about Hume's social utility or Plato's eternal soul, both seem to bump up against this really tricky problem you mentioned earlier, preconditions.
Yes, preconditions. This is central. The big question becomes, are we genuinely free when we make a choice, when we assert our will, or are we just acting out scripts written by our pre-existing preconditioned beliefs?
Okay, we need to unpack preconditions carefully. It sounds like more than just your past experiences. What exactly are they, according to these sources?
Think of preconditions as the whole framework. The accumulated moral codes, social norms, cultural values, the education you received, maybe even unconscious biases. It's the often unexamined operating system running your decisions.
Got it. So these beliefs and values I hold.
They act as the causes. They dictate the range of options you even consider, and they push you towards certain outcomes, which then get expressed as your decisions and your behavior.
Okay, I think I see the cause and effect jeopardy here. If I'm raised in a society where, say, stealing is absolutely taboo and helping others is highly praised, my internal preconditions make choosing to steal incredibly difficult and choosing to help much more likely. My moral belief system acts like a powerful causal filter on my will.
That's exactly the jeopardy. If that cause and effect chain holds true beliefs, cause actions, then this idea of an unconditional freedom of will, a will that can just choose anything regardless of prior conditioning, looks really shaky.
What's fascinating you mentioned earlier is that during the Enlightenment, with thinkers like Hobbes and Hume, the very idea of having strong morals was sometimes used against free will. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But think about it from a hard determinist perspective. If you always follow the ethical rules perfectly, are you demonstrating freedom?
Or am I just demonstrating that my conditioning was successful?
Exactly. Are you making a genuine choice? Or are you just behaving predictably according to the constraints, family, religion, society that have been instilled in you? For some determinists, strict ethical adherence wasn't proof of free will, but proof of effective external control.
Huh. So paradoxically, the only free person might be someone acting completely against their conditioning, perhaps even chaotically, which doesn't sound very moral.
It certainly complicates the picture. And it sets us up nicely to look at our first group of thinkers, those who really leaned into determinism, building their cases on causality, physics, and psychology. Right, when we look at the determinist camp, we find these really brilliant, distinct arguments trying to dismantle the idea of unconditional freedom. They come at it from different angles: metaphysics, physics, psychology. We really have to start with Leibniz.
Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. His framework around causality, the principle of sufficient reason, feels like a major pillar.
Absolutely monumental. And it's more subtle than just saying everything has a cause. His claim, the PSR, is that for any truth, there must be a reason sufficient to explain why things are the way they are, and not some other way.
So reality, for Leibniz, is fundamentally rational, perfectly explainable, perfectly causal.
Yes. If every state of the universe follows logically and necessarily from the previous state, then in principle the whole thing is predictable, like clockwork, though a very complex clock.
But Leibniz wasn't a pure materialist like Hobbes, was he? He had God and the soul in his system. How does that fit with strict causality?
That's the fascinating part. He introduces these concepts called monads. Think of them as fundamental, individual, non-physical units of reality spiritual substances almost. Each one contained its entire future state within itself, unfolding according to a pre-established harmony set up by God.
Okay, so God sets the program for each monad.
And since God is perfect, Leibniz argued, God chose the best of all possible worlds. This means the entire unfolding of history, including the path of every human soul, its development, its gaining of wisdom, was all part of this optimal preset plan.
Wow. So his denial of free will comes from both logic and theology, rather than just physics.
Precisely. For Leibniz, free will in the sense of uncaused choice just doesn't exist. Whatever path your soul takes, whatever desires you pursue, it's all part of the predetermined unfolding of your monad's nature, based on the conditioned thinking inherent in its God-given program.
So even though the soul learns and appreciates beauty and gains wisdom over time in his system,
That evolution itself is programmed. The sources emphasize this. His theory doesn't allow for genuinely spontaneous, uncaused changes in moral beliefs or direction. The whole thing is bound by cause and effect from the moment of creation, predictable in principle by God.
Okay, so Leibniz anchors determinism in logic and a kind of spiritual pre-programming. Then comes Thomas Hobbes, who just throws out the theology entirely, right?
Radically so. Hobbes wanted a purely scientific, mechanistic explanation for everything, including human beings. If the universe is just matter in motion, then humans are complex biological machines.
And our thoughts, desires, choices?
Just the result of physical forces acting on or within the machine. Matter impacting matter.
So how does he define the will in this purely physical system? It can't be some inner faculty of choice.
No, he strips it of all that. For Hobbes, the will is simply the last appetite in deliberation. And deliberation for him isn't careful reasoning.
What is it then?
It's just the back and forth, the alternating succession of contrary impulses or appetites, a physical tug of war inside you. The will is merely the final push, the appetite that wins out right before you perform the action.
So if I'm deciding between watching TV and going for a run, the will isn't my rational decision for health. It's just whichever impulse was physically stronger at the last moment.
That's exactly the Hobbesian picture. All the other competing impulses were just intentions, maybe strong ones, but only the winner gets called the will.
And what determines which impulse wins?
Pure self-gratification, or maybe more accurately, self-preservation, and the pursuit of pleasure or avoidance of pain. Hobbes argued that individuals only act in what they perceive to be their best interest, driven by these basic physical urges.
That's a pretty stark view. Our sources point out this directly contradicts ideas like altruism or religious principles like love thy neighbor.
Oh, absolutely. It's a radically self-interested model. If every action, even one that looks charitable, is ultimately dictated by this internal mechanism of self-gratification, a mechanism you didn't choose but just have as the biological machine, then free will seems impossible.
It has to be an illusion.
For Hobbes, yes. He thought the only freedom we experience is when there's no external physical thing stopping us from doing what our last appetite dictates. If you want to raise your arm, last appetite wins, and no chains are holding it down, you feel free to raise it. But the desire to raise it was determined.
So freedom is just the absence of external blockers, not internal freedom of choice.
You got it. The feeling of freedom is just realizing you can follow the dictates of your internal mechanics.
All right. From Leibniz's logic and theology to Hobbes's stark materialism. Then we get to David Hume. He builds on this deterministic line, but shifts the focus more to psychology.
That's right. Hume looked inward. He agreed with the general deterministic picture, but was fascinated by how predictable human motivation seemed to be and where that motivation actually came from.
And he didn't think it came primarily from reason.
No, he famously argued against the primacy of reason. He believed philosophers before him had vastly overestimated reason's role in driving action. For Hume, the real motivators are instinct and passion.
Not logic, but feelings, desires, emotions.
Exactly. He argued we are fundamentally driven by our passions and desires. These non-rational forces provide the real push, the impetus for causation that leads inevitably to determined outcomes. Reason comes in later.
This sounds like where his most famous, maybe most controversial statement comes in, that reason is, and ought to be, the slave of the passions.
It's an incredibly powerful line, deliberately provocative, especially in the 18th century. Hume's point was that reason, on its own, can't actually make you do anything. It can't generate a motivation from scratch, nor can it fight against a strong passion.
So what does reason do, in his view?
Two main things. First, it helps us figure out cause and effect how things in the world relate to each other. Second, it helps us figure out the best means to achieve the ends that our passions have already set for us.
Okay, so if my passion is, say, hunger, and I desire a sandwich.
Reason tells you, okay, there's a cafe down the street, you have money, you can walk there. Reason helps you get the sandwich. But reason didn't make you hungry, and crucially, reason alone can't make you not want the sandwich if the passion is strong enough.
Wow. So if the goal itself is set by non-rational passion, and reason is just the hired help finding the way there, the whole process is determined as soon as the passion kicks in.
That's the implication. Your action becomes the inevitable result of that initial psychological state, that driving passion. So Hume stands firmly against the idea of an unconditioned free will that can somehow override passion through pure reason.
It sounds quite similar to Hobbes's last appetite in a way, but located inside the mind in psychology rather than just raw physics. The strongest passion wins, and reason serves it.
That's a very good comparison. It's the inevitable playing out of our psychological makeup, driven by forces we don't fundamentally choose.
Okay, this is where things get maybe a bit tricky, because despite these really strong arguments against unconditional free will, both Hobbes and Hume often get labeled as compatibilists.
Right, and that sounds like a flat contradiction, doesn't it? If they think our actions are determined by appetites or passions, how can they possibly make room for free will?
Exactly. How does that work?
This is a really crucial philosophical move, and understanding the nuance is key. Compatibilism is the idea that, actually, causal determinism and some kind of free will can logically coexist. They aren't mutually exclusive.
Okay, so they're not arguing for that anything is possible, break the causal chain kind of freedom?
No, definitely not. They reject that kind of libertarian free will. What they're proposing is a more modest, conditional, maybe functional kind of freedom that can still exist even if our actions are ultimately determined.
What's the condition then? What makes this compatibility possible in their view?
The compatibility works, they argue, only if we understand freedom in a specific way, often linked back to those preconditions we talked about. For both Hobbes and Hume, freedom is often defined negatively.
Meaning?
Meaning freedom is simply the absence of external constraint or coercion when you act according to your desires or will.
So back to Hobbes's example. If I have the last appetite to raise my arm and nothing is physically stopping my arm from moving,
then in that specific sense, you are free to raise your arm. The act is free from external impediment. But the desire itself, the last appetite, was still determined by your internal state.
okay, I think I get that definition of freedom from outside force. But if the internal desire itself is determined, why even call it free will? Why not just stick with determinism? Why make this compatibilist move?
That's a great question. I think it's partly because they wanted to preserve the possibility of moral responsibility. They differentiate between the freedom of the act, was I forced by someone else, and the freedom of the will's formation. Where did the desire come from?
So how does that distinction play out in compatibilism?
In some compatibilist views, maybe not explicitly Hobbes or Hume's, but related ones, there's an idea that maybe at some point, perhaps developmentally or historically, the agent freely chose or adopted the core beliefs, values, or character traits, the preconditions that now determine their actions.
Ah, like setting up your own internal programming.
Kind of. Once those preconditions are set, your character, your fixed desires, your subsequent actions flow deterministically from them. But because they flow from your character, your desires, you can still be held responsible. You're acting in character, even if that character itself determines the action.
It's like, I chose the rules of the game earlier, so now I'm responsible for playing by those rules, even if each move is determined by the rules.
That's a really good analogy. They don't deny choice as a human feature, the ability to act without being physically pushed around. But that choice is always guided, maybe even dictated, by your existing beliefs, your character, your passions.
So Hobbes's compatibilism is very physical. You're free if no external object stops you. Hume's is more psychological. You're free if your action flows from your internal character and passions without external force.
Exactly. In both cases, the action follows necessarily from the preceding state, physical or psychological. But the agent isn't being coerced by something outside their own nature. So they can be seen as free in that limited compatibilist sense.
It sounds like a way to salvage moral responsibility. If hard determinism is true, accountability seems to vanish. But with compatibilism,
You can potentially keep both. You can acknowledge the reality of cause and effect, the influence of our nature and nurture, and still have a basis for saying, yes, but you acted according to your own will, so you're responsible. It keeps the justice system and social praise and blame somewhat intact.
it preserves social stability, perhaps?
That's certainly a powerful motivation behind compatibilism. It avoids the potentially chaotic implications of pure determinism while still trying to be consistent with a scientific or causal worldview.
Okay, so we've seen the determinists and the compatibilist solution. Now let's turn to the thinkers who perhaps offered a more robust defense, or at least a more complex picture of genuine, maybe even unconditioned choice. Plato and Hegel.
Right. These two bring in different elements, Plato with his focus on the soul and belief formation, and Hegel with his grand vision of evolution and spirit.
Plato's view seems particularly interesting because, as you hinted, he almost argues both sides. He lays out different possibilities.
He does. It's quite nuanced. Let's look at his first theory, the one that seems most strongly pro-free will. Plato suggests that human beings have a fundamental freedom when it comes to forming their belief systems. We choose what we value, what we hold to be true or good.
So the initial setup is free.
Yes. And then these freely chosen beliefs become the conditions, the causes that shape how we subsequently assert our will.
Yeah.
The crucial point is the timing. The initial formation of the cause, the adoption of the belief, is a free act of the individual will.
And this is why, for Plato, the soul carries responsibility for its journey after death, because it freely chose the moral inputs that guided its life.
That seems to be the core idea there. If I freely choose to value wisdom above all else, that belief system then provides the causes that incline my will toward seeking knowledge, making philosophical inquiry, and so on. The belief was chosen freely, the actions follow from that choice.
That grants a really significant kind of freedom at the foundation. But then you mentioned a second theory, or maybe a limitation, the deterministic trap.
Right. Plato also talks about free will as the seat of discernment. This is our capacity to distinguish and choose between virtue, integrity, the good, and vice, wrongdoing.
That still sounds like freedom of choice. Where's the trap?
The trap, or the limitation, lies in how active this freedom needs to be. Plato seems to suggest that real free will exists only in the moments when we consciously, deliberately choose to change our fundamental moral beliefs.
So it's not a constant state, but an act.
Exactly. If we don't engage in that difficult work of reevaluating and potentially changing our core beliefs, if we just coast along with the moral framework we already have, then we fall into the trap.
Meaning
Meaning that unless those foundational moral beliefs are actively changed, the existing preconditions, the mindset you adopted earlier, will just continue to provide the deterministic causes for your actions. Your life path becomes predictable, determined by the beliefs you're no longer actively choosing or questioning.
So freedom for Plato isn't just having the capacity. It's exercising the capacity to fundamentally reorient your soul, your beliefs. If you don't exercise it, you live deterministically based on your past free choices.
That's a great way to summarize the tension in Plato. You have the potential for radical freedom, but it requires constant vigilance and willingness to change at the deepest level. Otherwise, your past choices lock you onto a determined path.
Fascinating. Okay, now let's make the leap forward in time to Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. A very different philosophical system, much more focused on history, evolution, spirit.
Absolutely. Hegel's argument for free will is powerful, but also notoriously complex. It's tied into his whole philosophy of history and the development of spirit or mind.
He saw everything as part of an evolutionary process.
Yes, a continuous state of becoming. Consciousness itself, for Hegel, is evolving. It's moving towards greater self-awareness, greater rationality, towards realizing what he called the absolute idea. He saw this as a process involving the entire cosmos, often linked to a divine or rational principle unfolding in history.
Okay, so within this grand evolutionary, almost spiritual picture, how does he define real, absolute free will?
His definition is very distinctive and quite abstract. He says the will is truly free only when it wills itself alone, wills the will.
Wills itself alone. Wills the will. What does that mean practically?
It means the will isn't seeking something external to itself. It's not driven by desires for objects or social status, or even just following external laws or customs blindly. Instead, the truly free will seeks only its own essence, which is freedom and rationality. It's about self-determination in the purest sense.
So as long as I'm chasing, I don't know, a promotion at work or trying to impress my neighbors or just following tradition without thinking, my will isn't truly free according to Hegel.
Exactly. Those external goals, those social norms, those unexamined customs, those are the preconditions that Hegel believes bind the will and keep it unfree. They are alien constraints imposed upon its true nature.
So how do we achieve this absolute will? How do we become free in Hegel's sense?
Through a process of critique and self-awareness. Hegel argues that human beings must actively, rigorously work to eliminate preconditions. This means deconstructing false ideas, questioning inherited dogma, challenging arbitrary social structures, all the things we've internalized that aren't based on universal reason.
That sounds like a constant struggle, a kind of intellectual and spiritual purification process.
It is. It's deeply tied to the progress of reason and self-consciousness throughout history and within the individual. Freedom isn't just something you have, it's something you achieve and must continually maintain by freeing yourself from these external dependencies and aligning your will with universal reason.
So Hegel ultimately supports the potential for free will, but it's achieved through ongoing spiritual and intellectual development, the evolution of consciousness itself.
Precisely. It's not found in the simple mechanics of choice like in Hobbes, or even the initial belief setting of Plato. For Hegel, ultimate freedom is a historical and personal achievement, the realization of the will's true, rational, self-determining nature. It's a goal we strive towards. Hashtag conclusion and final thoughts.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive has really shown the incredible range of thinking here. It's definitely not a simple yes or no to free will. It's about how these brilliant minds constructed the very mechanisms of choice, cause, desire, reason. Let's try to quickly recap the core mechanisms we saw.
Sure. We started with Leibniz, who saw reality through the lens of rational necessity, his principle of sufficient reason. Everything, even the soul's path, is predetermined within a logically perfect God-ordained system.
Then Hobbes brought it crashing down to earth, pure materialism. The will is just the last appetite, the winning physical impulse driven by unavoidable self-interest.
Hume then took that deterministic thread into psychology. Reason is the slave of the passions. Our actions are predictably driven by our feelings and instincts, not by free, rational choice overriding them.
But then we saw more complexity. Plato offered a path to freedom through the initial, difficult choice of forming our core beliefs, but warned that we can fall into a deterministic rut if we don't actively reevaluate and change those beliefs.
Right. And finally, Hegel presented freedom as an evolutionary achievement. The will is only truly free when it wills itself, demanding a constant effort to shed external preconditions and align with universal reason through ongoing intellectual and spiritual progress.
Looking across these five, there seems to be a fascinating tension that the sources highlight, especially regarding theology versus pure rationale.
There really is. You notice that many of the thinkers who argue most forcefully against free will, like Hobbes and Hume, and arguably Leibniz in his logical mode, base their arguments heavily on empirical observation, logic, the seemingly unbreakable chain of cause and effect.
They stick to what can be reasoned out or observed in the material or psychological world.
Exactly, but as soon as theology or metaphysics enters the picture, more strongly thinking about a transcendent God, an immortal soul capable of change, or a cosmic purpose like Hegel's evolving spirit.
The dynamic shifts. Suddenly there's potential space for something to break the purely material or logical causal chain.
Precisely. Introducing a non-material cause, something outside the predictable physical system, like a soul making a choice that isn't just brain chemistry or God intervening or spirit realizing itself. It fundamentally changes the terms of the debate. It moves beyond pure logic and physics into questions of fundamental ontology. What kind of reality do we actually live in?
It seems like sticking strictly to philosophical rationale, to logic and observation, tends to corner free will. But introducing faith or metaphysical concepts opens the door again, though perhaps moving beyond pure philosophy.
That's a fair assessment of the tension presented. The purely rational arguments often struggle to find room for unconditional freedom, while arguments incorporating non-material elements can posit it more easily, but perhaps rely on premises outside of empirical verification.
Okay, so let's bring this home with a final thought for you, the listener. Philosophers often categorize the different stances on this whole problem. We've basically touched on them all.
Right. Broadly speaking, you have three main camps regarding free will and determinism. First, the compatibilists. We saw this with Hobbes and Hume. They argue that some form of free will, usually defined as freedom from coercion, can coexist with determinism. The two aren't logically contradictory.
Okay.
Second, the incompatibilists. These thinkers say, no, free will and determinism are fundamentally opposed. This camp includes two subgroups. The hard determinists, like perhaps Leibniz or early Hobbes, who say determinism is true, therefore free will is an illusion. And the libertarians, not political but philosophical, who say we do have free will, therefore determinism must be false.
And the third group. You mentioned they're often overlooked.
The impossibilists.
Yeah.
They basically argue that the whole concept of free will, that we seem to want one that can ground moral responsibility, is actually incoherent or impossible to achieve, regardless of whether determinism is true or false.
Yeah.
They might say neither determined actions nor purely random, uncaused actions give us the kind of control responsibility requires.
Okay. Compatibilists, they can coexist. Incompatibilists, they can't. And impossibilists, free will itself is the problem.
That's the basic map.
So here's the provocative thought to leave you with. We've spent this time exploring how incredibly challenging the idea of preconditions is, those ingrained beliefs and cultural norms that shape us. And we know society absolutely relies on some notion of responsibility for its justice systems to function. Given that reality, which of these frameworks, compatibilism, incompatibilism, either hard determinism or libertarianism, or even impossibilism, offers the most practical, the most useful, maybe the most livable way for us to think about and govern human behavior today? Where do you land, knowing what these great minds wrestled with?
That's the question that keeps this debate alive and relevant, century after century. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the intricate mechanics